The restaurant glowed with warm light against the dark street outside, its glass windows casting reflections of neon signs and passing cars. Inside, the low hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the kitchen. The booths were full of tired workers grabbing late meals, groups of friends lingering over drinks, and strangers seeking shelter from the cold night air. Moving quietly among them, balancing trays that seemed heavier than they were, was a young black waitress. Her uniform was crisp, though worn from too many washes, her apron tied neatly around her waist, a pencil tucked behind one ear. To the customers she served, she was a smile, a nod, a polite voice offering refills and menus. To herself, she was a storm of fear she never dared to show. Each time she approached a table, she forced her lips into a smile, the kind that looked genuine under the dim light but felt paper-thin from the inside. She laughed politely when customers made jokes, even when her mind was too heavy to process the humor. She scribbled down orders quickly, carried plates with steady hands, and answered every request with quiet efficiency. No one looking at her would have guessed that her chest was tight with anxiety, that the numbers running through her head were not table counts or tips, but overdue balances and threats from collectors. She had grown skilled at hiding it. Her eyes gave nothing away as she poured coffee or placed a plate in front of a stranger. The fear lived deeper, behind the mask she had trained herself to wear, surfacing only when she retreated to the kitchen to catch her breath. There, in the brief silence between tasks, her mind would flicker back to the stack of letters she kept in a drawer at home, each one more urgent than the last. She carried them in her thoughts as if they weighed as much as the trays in her hands. Her coworkers sometimes teased her for being too quiet, for keeping to herself even during breaks. They did not know she used those stolen moments to check her phone, scrolling through messages she dreaded, reminders of bills unpaid, and threats of what would happen if she did not comply. She deleted most of them quickly, shoving the fear down before anyone could glimpse it in her expression. The restaurant was her stage, and every shift was another performance of calmness she did not feel. The late-night crowd was rowdy at times, laughing loudly, demanding more drinks, snapping their fingers impatiently. But she endured it all without complaint. Every dollar mattered. Every tip was another inch of ground gained against the pit she was sinking into. She told herself she could not afford to falter, that if she cracked for even a moment, the whole fragile act might collapse. So she kept smiling, her face illuminated by the soft light of the restaurant, her steps measured as she wove through the aisles. But under the surface, her mind churned. She thought of the debts pressing closer each day, of collectors who spoke to her with voices sharp as knives, of the fear that someday they might not be content with phone calls and letters. She thought of what it would mean if the people she worked beside discovered the truth, if her manager realized she was not just a tired waitress, but a young woman drowning silently in obligations she could not escape. The idea terrified her, so she carried her secrets with the same practiced balance she used for her trays, never letting them spill, never letting anyone see how much they weighed. That night, she moved from table to table with the same composure she always did, her eyes kind, her hands steady. To the diners, she was simply another worker, invisible beyond the service she provided. To herself, she was a shadow, moving through the glow of the restaurant while carrying the darkness of her debts inside her chest. The door opened with a sharp jingle of the bell, and for a moment the warmth of the restaurant seemed to falter as a cold draft swept in. Two men stepped across the threshold, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. They wore tailored suits far too fine for a late-night diner, their crisp white shirts gleaming beneath the dim overhead lights. Conversations dipped as a few customers glanced up, sensing something in their posture that did not belong. Their movements were smooth, but the air around them carried a heaviness, an authority sharpened into something colder than professionalism. The taller of the two adjusted his tie and let his eyes drift across the room. They were pale and sharp, scanning the booths and tables with the detached focus of a hunter surveying prey. The other, broader in build, carried himself with the lazy swagger of someone who already knew the outcome of whatever confrontation awaited him. Their presence did not blend into the easy chaos of the diner. They disrupted it. Even before a word was spoken, they shifted the mood, drawing unease into the air like smoke. The waitress felt it instantly. She had just set down a plate of eggs and hash browns for a trucker in the corner booth when she noticed them. The way their heads turned in unison, the way their gaze skimmed over the other patrons only to settle on her with unsettling precision. Her breath caught in her chest. She forced her hands to stay steady as she tucked her order pad back into her apron, but her pulse betrayed her, quickening until it felt like a drumbeat in her ears. They did not sit down like normal customers. Instead, they remained standing, their bodies angled toward her, their smirks forming almost at the same time. It was the look of men who had been searching for something, and now that they had found it, they intended to savor the moment. She knew that expression too well. She had seen it at her door, on the street, in the faces of men who wore debt like a weapon, and wielded it without hesitation. Her stomach tightened, but she turned away as though she had not noticed, moving briskly toward the counter, where a fresh pot of coffee steamed. She hoped they might change their minds, that perhaps they were here for someone else, but deep down she knew better. Collectors did not wear their intentions lightly. They carried them like armor, and once their eyes were locked on you, there was no mistaking it. The taller man leaned toward his partner, murmuring something too low for others to hear, and the two of them chuckled. The sound carried across the diner anyway, sharp and mocking. A couple sitting near the window shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing tension but not understanding its source. One of the cooks poked his head out from the kitchen, wiped his hands on a towel, and then ducked back, choosing not to involve himself. The hum of conversation began again, but it was thinner now, strained. Everyone felt the shift even if they did not name it. The waitress carried a tray of glasses to a booth, her hands shaking just enough that one of them clinked loudly against the surface. She forced herself to smile, to murmur the usual pleasantries, but her thoughts were fixed on the two men by the door. Their smirks had not faded. They moved slowly toward her now, weaving between tables with a deliberate pace of men who enjoyed being seen. Every step seemed designed to remind her that they controlled the moment, that they thrived on her awareness of them. Her chest grew tight as she realized there was no hiding tonight. They had come for her, and they would not leave without making sure she felt it. She tried to keep moving, balancing her tray, pouring coffee, refilling glasses, but the footsteps behind her followed with deliberate rhythm. By the time she reached the counter, the two men were already there, sliding into her path with smirks carved across their faces. One leaned an elbow on the counter as though he owned the space, while the other stepped close enough that she could feel the weight of his stare. Her shoulders stiffened, but she forced herself to look busy, arranging silverware, grabbing an order slip, anything to avoid their eyes. "Working hard tonight, aren't you?" the taller one said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the diner. He tilted his head, studying her with mock amusement. All these shifts, all these tables, but somehow the numbers never seemed to add up. The other let out a laugh that drew glances from nearby customers. He tapped the counter with one manicured finger, slow and deliberate. "She thinks if she keeps hiding behind that apron, maybe we'll forget. Maybe the debt just disappears if she smiles enough." His tone dripped with condescension, loud enough for the families in the booths to hear. Her face flushed, the heat burning beneath her skin. She picked up a glass of water to deliver to a waiting table, but her hand trembled, the surface rippling with each step. The shorter man noticed and chuckled, pointing at her shaking fingers. "Look at that! Can't even carry a glass without her hands giving her away. Wonder how she thought she could carry all that debt." The words landed harder than she wanted to admit. She kept her eyes down, pretending not to hear, but the laughter that followed pierced through her composure. A mother sitting with her child looked over quickly before lowering her gaze, embarrassed for her, unwilling to intervene. Another customer shifted in his seat and cleared his throat, but said nothing. Silence spread in patches, broken only by the forced clinking of utensils as people tried to ignore what was happening. The taller collector leaned closer, lowering his voice only slightly, enough to make it sound more dangerous. You thought you could hide, didn't you? Skipping calls, ignoring letters. Did you really think we wouldn't find you? His grin widened as her eyes flickered upward before she could stop herself. There it is, he said with a smirk. That look. The look of someone who knows she's caught. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her apron strings feeling too tight, her hands clutching the counter behind her to keep herself from shaking. She wanted to vanish, to disappear into the back kitchen, but her legs refused to move. The second man straightened, raising his voice so the nearest tables could hear clearly. 80 hours a week and still nothing to show for it. Maybe she should just admit she's drowning. Maybe she should ask her customers to chip in for the check. His partner laughed loudly, the sound bouncing off the tiled floor. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from breaking, the sting grounding her as she tried to maintain a facade of calm. But the truth was slipping through, her trembling hands betraying her, her pale face revealing the humiliation that burned through her veins. She glanced around, but no one stepped forward. The other waitresses were busy avoiding her eyes, the cook in the back pretending to focus on orders. The collectors had chosen their stage well. The laughter came again, sharp and cruel. Keep smiling, sweetheart, one of them sneered. Maybe it'll cover the cracks long enough for the whole place to forget you owe everything and more. Her forced smile faltered, her lips trembling as she turned away, but their voices followed, cutting through the fragile shield she had tried so hard to build, turning her quiet suffering into a public display she could no longer control. The sound of their mocking laughter rippled through the room, sharper than the clatter of plates or the hum of conversation. The young waitress stood stiffly by the counter, her fingers gripping the edge as though the polished surface might anchor her in place. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it must be audible, but all she heard was the steady cruelty of the two men towering over her. Their voices rose and fell deliberately, pitched just high enough to carry into every corner of the diner. At the nearest booth, a family who had been halfway through their meal froze mid-bite. The mother glanced up, her brows knitting with unease, but when her husband shook his head slightly, she looked back down at her plate. The child at their table stared openly, wide-eyed, until the mother urged him to eat. Across the aisle, two college students whispered to one another, stealing glances at the scene before returning to their glowing phones, pretending the humiliation unraveling before them was not their business. The other waitresses moved quickly between tables, eyes fixed on trays and menus, their steps suddenly quicker, as if distance could erase the discomfort. One brushed past the young waitress and muttered a soft apology, but she did not look up, did not dare break the fragile silence she had built around herself. The cook's face appeared briefly through the serving window, his mouth opening as if to call out, then closing again. He wiped his hands on his apron and vanished, the order bell remaining still. The taller of the collectors smirked and leaned closer, his cologne sharp against the air. "No one's going to save you," he said. "Not just for her, but for the whole diner to hear." He tapped his finger against the counter in slow rhythm. "You think any of these people care? Look around. They're already pretending you don't exist." She did look, against her better judgment, and the sight hollowed her out. Customers who had once met her smile when she poured their coffee now stared at their plates. A man in a suit shifted uncomfortably and adjusted his tie, but his eyes never left the window. A pair of friends at the bar sipped their drinks faster, avoiding her gaze, hoping to drown the awkwardness in silence. Each averted glance cut deeper than the words themselves. Her throat tightened as the second collector chuckled, raising his voice to ensure every table caught his tone. "She works herself to the bone, but she's still nothing more than a ghost with bills she'll never pay." The laughter that followed was meant to sting, and it did, echoing inside her ribs like the crack of a whip. She clenched her jaw, fighting to keep her lips pressed into something resembling composure, but the effort burned through her. Each insult landed like a strike she could not dodge, breaking her down piece by piece. Her hands trembled, betraying her even as she tried to stand tall. She felt stripped of every defense, her suffering laid bare for strangers who chose silence over kindness. No one moved to stop them. No one told the men to leave. The weight of her humiliation settled heavy on her shoulders. And in that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had before. Her dignity crumbling in the middle of a room full of people who pretended not to see her at all. The laughter of the collectors still lingered in the air when the scrape of a chair echoed from the far corner of the diner. It was not loud, but it carried with a weight that seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound, and in that instant, the atmosphere shifted. From a booth half hidden in shadow, a figure rose slowly to his full height, his shoulders stretching the fabric of a fitted tracksuit. The overhead lights caught the glint of polished gold resting on the seat beside him, the unmistakable gleam of a championship belt. He was known to the world, though in the dim glow of the diner he looked less like a celebrity and more like a force of nature. Broad-chested and muscular, his every movement radiated strength, held in careful control. The staff recognized him first, their eyes widening in disbelief, and whispers darted from table to table like sparks. A name rose on hushed lips, but no one dared to say it too loudly. The champion had come here quietly, but now there was nothing quiet about his presence. He stepped forward, each stride measured, the floor seeming to hum beneath his weight. The collectors faltered, their smug expressions stiffening as his shadow fell across the counter. Conversations died mid-sentence, silverware stilled against plates, and even the restless hum of the kitchen quieted as cooks leaned against the window to watch. The young waitress froze, her body caught between fear and relief, her eyes wide as she realized who had been sitting only a few yards away while she endured the humiliation. The champion did not speak at first. He simply stood there, towering, his arms folded across his chest. His gaze swept over the two men, who had moments before laughed so loudly at her trembling hands. Under the weight of his eyes, the collectors straightened their ties, shifting uneasily in suits that suddenly seemed too tight. The silence stretched, more powerful than any words, filling the room with a tension that made every breath seem loud. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deep, and steady, but it carried the authority of someone used to commanding arenas filled with roaring crowds. "That's enough," he said, the words landing like a hammer. He did not raise his tone, yet the conviction behind it made the insult-laden air collapse into stillness. The waitress blinked rapidly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had imagined countless times that someone might intervene, that someone might tell the collectors to stop, but she had never pictured this. Not a man whose fists had won titles, whose name was chanted around the world, standing now in her small corner of despair. His presence a shield she had not known she needed. The champion took another step closer, his sheer size dwarfing the collectors. He did not clench his fists or posture with aggression. He did not need to. His reputation and the raw power in his stance were enough. The diners who had averted their eyes earlier now leaned forward, captivated, as if they were witnessing a fight begin before the first punch was thrown. The collectors tried to mask their unease with thin smirks, but their laughter had vanished. One of them muttered something under his breath, an attempt at defiance, but the champion's eyes silenced him more effectively than a blow. He shifted his gaze back to the waitress, softening only slightly, a silent reassurance that the torment she had endured would not continue. The diner held its breath, the moment balanced on the edge of what would come next. The champion stood firm, the embodiment of strength and justice, in a place where fear had reigned only moments earlier, and in his presence, the cruelty that had seemed so overwhelming began to wither. The champion's steps echoed softly as he crossed the last stretch of floor, the hush of the diner, broken only by the faint clatter of a fork someone nervously set down on a plate. He moved with deliberate ease, every line of his body radiating control rather than haste. The collectors straightened when they realized he was coming toward them, their smirks faltering as his shadow fell over the counter where the waitress stood frozen. She clutched her order pad to her chest, her hands trembling, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but could not form words. He stopped directly in front of her, towering over the two men who had cornered her moments before. Folding his arms across his broad chest, he let his silence speak first. His stare was cold, sharp as steel, pinning them in place until neither dared to move. The gold chain at his neck glinted faintly in the diner's lights, a reminder of the life he had built with fists and willpower. But it was not the gold that carried weight here. It was the man himself, the sheer force of presence that could still an entire room. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, deep, and calm, yet it carried a power that rolled through the room like thunder. "Back off," he said. 2 words, simple but absolute. They did not rise in volume, did not break into anger, but they landed with such finality that even the clink of dishes from the kitchen paused. The taller collector swallowed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He tried to recover his smirk, but the edges of it wavered. "This doesn't concern you," he muttered. His voice pitched lower now, lacking the swagger it had carried just minutes earlier. He gestured vaguely toward the waitress, as if she were an object rather than a person. "She owes, and we're here to remind her of it." The champion's gaze did not flicker. His arms remained crossed, his shoulders squared, his expression unchanging. "I said back off," he repeated, not louder, but with such certainty it left no space for argument. The second collector shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner, as though searching for reassurance he could not find. The waitress let out a shaky breath she had not realized she had been holding. For the first time all night, she felt a wall between herself and the men who had been tearing her dignity apart in front of strangers. She looked up at the champion's broad frame, the calm strength in his posture, and though she said nothing, her eyes glistened with gratitude and disbelief. The diners who had earlier looked away now leaned forward, watching the scene unfold with cautious anticipation. Some exchanged hushed whispers, recognizing the champion, realizing this was no ordinary man intervening. Others simply sat in silence, transfixed by the reversal of power playing out before them. The taller collector licked his lips, his eyes darting toward the exit before flicking back. He was weighing his options and finding fewer than he liked. His partner shifted his jaw, attempting one last show of defiance. "You don't know what she owes," he said, though his tone lacked bite. "You don't know what she's hiding." The champion's stare cut into him, unflinching, unwavering. "I don't need to," he replied. "What I know is this ends now." The weight of those words left no room for further taunts. The collectors glanced at each other, the confidence drained from their faces. They had chosen the wrong night, the wrong place, the wrong victim. Slowly, reluctantly, they stepped back. The champion did not move until they created distance between themselves and the waitress. His eyes followed them, steady as a blade held to their throats without ever being drawn. The collectors turned, muttering under their breath, and retreated toward the door with their earlier swagger broken. When the bell above the entrance jingled again, the room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. The champion remained where he was for a moment longer, his arms still folded, his presence still dominating the room, before finally turning slightly to glance at the waitress. She met his eyes, her throat tight with unspoken words, her relief spilling across her face. In that silence, she understood that the torment which had once felt unending had been stopped with nothing more than a voice too steady to challenge. The weeks that followed carried a different rhythm for the young waitress. The familiar weight in her chest, the constant dread that had once shadowed every shift, no longer pressed against her ribs. The collectors who had haunted her with letters, calls, and humiliations in public places had gone silent. Their voices, once sharp and mocking, no longer echoed in her ears. What replaced them was a cautious sense of safety. Fragile at first, but growing steadier with each passing day. She moved through the diner with her head lifted higher, her smile no longer forced into place but formed naturally as she carried plates to customers. Her hands did not tremble anymore when she poured coffee, her body no longer betraying the fear she once fought so hard to hide. The champion had kept his word. In the days after the confrontation, he made sure the worst of her debt was cleared, shielding her from the threats that had dominated her nights. He had looked her in the eyes when she tried to protest, when she tried to insist she could not accept such help, and he told her plainly that dignity could not grow in the soil of constant fear. He explained that strength, the kind he had been praised for in the ring, was meaningless if it was not used to stand between cruelty and the vulnerable. She had been too stunned to argue. For the first time in years, someone had stepped in not to judge her but to lift her. It was not only the money he changed. One morning he walked into the diner, not for a meal but for her, and told her he wanted her to manage part of his training facility. She had blinked in disbelief, staring at him as though he had spoken another language. He explained that she already possessed the discipline, the work ethic, and the strength to carry responsibility. She had spent years managing chaos under pressure, hiding storms behind a smile, balancing tasks no one else had noticed. Those skills, he said, were exactly what his facility needed. He told her he trusted her, and the simple weight of that trust nearly undid her. Weeks later, she stood at his side beneath the bright lights of a press event, a place she had never imagined herself. Reporters crowded the room, cameras flashing as the champion addressed the gathering. He spoke about his career, about the battles he had fought in arenas filled with noise and spectacle, but then his words shifted. His tone softened, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had seen more than punches and victories. He gestured toward her, drawing the eyes of the entire room. He told them she had reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten. That real strength was not measured in fists or titles or belts of gold, but in the courage of those who endured in silence, who carried unbearable burdens and still managed to rise each day. He spoke of the night she had been humiliated in front of strangers, of the cruelty she had faced, and of the way her dignity had still shone through. He called her the reason he believed again in what he could do outside the ring, the reason he wanted to use his voice and his name for more than victory. She stood beside him, her hands folded calmly, her face steady, though her heart raced under the barrage of camera flashes. This time, there was no shame, no trembling. She was not the shadow hiding behind trays and forced smiles. She was a woman recognized for her strength, introduced not as a victim but as someone whose resilience had lit a fire in a champion. The applause that rose in the hall was not for him alone. It was for her too. For the first time in years, she felt secure. The fear that had once defined her life had been replaced by a sense of belonging, a recognition she had never expected to know. And as she stood in the glow of the cameras beside the man who had given her protection when she needed it most, she understood that her story had become something larger than survival. It had become a testament to the truth that justice and strength are bound not in power, but in the courage to see those the world tries to ignore.